So let's now take a look at one final example. I thought you guys might appreciate this game. It was played all the way back in 1925. It is a miniature, but hopefully an instructive miniature at that. So white opened up with the move pawn to d4. And here black played the move pawn to f5. This move, the Dutch defense, it's already, by the way, in placing a pawn from f7 to f5, we see he's advancing the pawn, and we know that that creates some weaknesses. And he's also leaving his pawn on a light square, so an advanced light square. So you might have already guessed that in the Dutch defense, this square e5 can become quite weak, especially sometimes black will follow with pawn to d5, and then the e5 square can become a very strong outpost for white. Now, white in this game played e4, which I do not recommend in today's chess. It's not the best way to handle the Dutch. Now, pawn takes e4, knight c3, knight f6, and g4. Really going after that knight and perhaps going after the king. Pawn to d5 to save the pawn, because white's threat was pawn to g5 and then to recover the pawn. g5 anyway. Knight to g8, and now very interesting move, pawn to f3. So white is okay with not actually recovering his pawn, but instead playing a pawn down. Pawn takes f3, queen takes f3, e6, and bishop to d3. So let's stop for a second and ask ourselves where the weak squares might be here. Well, the first thing that we notice is those central pawns are on light squares. So the dark squares like e5 and c5 and maybe even f4, g5, we see that white has much greater control over that set of squares. So we would say white has better control over the dark squares, and of all of those squares, perhaps the one that stands out most is this e5 square. Why? Because of the mix of pawns being on the other color, the light squares for black, and also notice how the d7 pawn has already moved to d5, meaning that there is no way to control that square. And as for the f7 pawn, that's no longer on the board. One other thing we had said is when a pawn disappears altogether, it will leave behind weaknesses along light squares and dark squares combined. So here we can see that there are some general weaknesses on the light squares as well as on the dark squares. Black went pawn to g6, but this move weakens further the control of those dark squares. White now went knight g to e2, queen e7, and bishop to f4. Sure enough, the square, the e5 square that is under white's control, now white threatens to place his bishop on that point. Black continues to play not so well. He plays the move pawn to c6, placing all of his pawns, or nearly all of his pawns, on light squares. And as we know, this will worsen the situation for him on the dark squares. Bishop to e5, bishop to g7, queen to g3. And now already, white threatens to win a piece. So knight a6 and castle. And we see that white can use this open f-file to his advantage. Bishop d7 and now bishop to d6. So we see that white is not attached to leaving his bishop on this weak square, but instead he can use another weak square. The queen had to step back to d8, and now the quiet move, queen to f4, with not one but two threats of checkmate. White is threatening queen f7 checkmate, but also notice his control over those dark squares is so strong that he's also threatening queen f8 checkmate, because after bishop takes queen, rook takes bishop will be checkmate. So there is no way to defend against these threats, and so black resigned. If, for example, queen to b6, then queen f7 check would be more than sufficient, since the bishop and then the rook will fall. But as said, queen f8 check, bishop takes, and rook takes f8 is immediately checkmate, and no surprise, the attack comes along those dark squares that are extremely weakened, because white has his central pawn on d4 and also this kingside pawn on g5 on the dark squares, and black has those pawns on light squares. So now that we've finished this topic, let's do a quick review of some of the most important points. First of all, I should say that creating weaknesses is unavoidable. We're not asking you to avoid creating weaknesses in future games, because in fact that would be an impossible request. The second you move pawns on some level, you are creating weaknesses. So already from move 1, if you choose pawn to e4 or pawn to d4, there are some weaknesses as a result of advancing that pawn. However, there are also some benefits. In this final position here, we have a very, very strong control of many of the light squares, and that's quite a good thing. The problem is that black paid too heavy of a price on the other set of squares, and as you can see in this variation, it cost him dearly. So weaknesses must be created. The important point is to have a good balance, to not create more weaknesses than needed. So that's the first thing. Then the next thing I want to say is I want to list out some questions that you guys should ask yourselves when identifying weaknesses in your camp or in your opponent's camp. So the first question is, on what color are the pawns placed? And in general, you should be looking for weaknesses on the other color complex. The next question is, how advanced are his pawns? So, for example, his pawns on a7 and b7 haven't advanced at all. So it's much less likely that you will find too many weak squares around the queen side. However, his pawn's c6 has advanced once, so that may leave some weaknesses. In fact, it did. His d7 pawn has gone to d5, that's advanced twice, so perhaps we can look for weaknesses along the adjacent squares. His e-pawn, that has advanced once, so again, we may find some weaknesses here, such as e7, or even consequent weakness of f8, because this whole diagonal has been opened up. And we can do the same again for the pawn on g6. We can note weak squares like h6, f6, and even g7. So that is the next point. And the other question is, which pawns are missing? So in this case, we can see that there is no pawn on the f file for black. And so that, as we have said, can lead to weaknesses created along not one particular set of squares, but along both color complexes. One closing comment to just get you guys into the habit of asking yourselves this question is, if, for instance, you notice, like in this position, black is very, very weak along the dark squares, an important question to ask is, does he have the dark squared bishop? Because that can go a long way to patching up those weaknesses. So here in this very final position, there is no dark squared bishop, although if we go back, of course, for most of the game, black at least did have this dark squared bishop. It just was not enough. But as you saw, the bishop did control a few of those important dark squares, but he was simply up against too many pieces, the queen, the bishop, and the rook all combining. But it's important, if we imagine in this position, even if it was not checkmate, the fact that white has this dark squared bishop could mean that he could play a move like bishop to e5, and in the absence of black's dark squared bishop, his own pieces and his own dark squares become a lot more vulnerable. So that's another slightly more advanced question to ask yourself, but I thought I'd throw it out there so that some of you guys will already get into that habit. So that's it as far as this section goes. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I will see you in the next one.